Hey all, welcome to another quick Circle Stories video, and this one is all about fairy places in Irish lore. So I was asked this question on a podcast recently, and it's one I get asked about quite a bit on Circle Stories. So I suppose if you follow the page you will know that looking to have a fairy encounter is not a good idea when you look at all of the examples in Irish lore, but we'll go through a few supposed fairy places in this very quick video. So first and foremost, the places that people might initially think are good places to have fairy encounters are fairy forts themselves. Now, the problem with this is not all fairy forts are very ancient, not all are prehistoric. Many are from medieval times and a little bit later. Oftentimes they might be dwellings, and that's all. So it's worth separating the newer fairy forts and the functional fairy forts, if you like, in terms of farming and homesteads and so on, from the ceremonial fairy forts. And I suppose the best way to distinguish between them would be to go onto the National Monuments database, and you can find out just how old the fairy forts are. But oftentimes you'll find there might be a standing stone, or they might be close to something that looks quite ceremonial. Now, also, that does not necessarily mean that they're places associated with fairies, but if you want to find out if they are, you could actually go onto ducas.ie and you might find fairy stories associated with particular places that way. So that's one thing. Places that turn up in Irish mythology, places like Newgrange, Loch Gur, I was going to say Omnagat, but we'll keep that separate for a second, Tara. These places are associated with power and ceremony and sovereignty and astronomy, but they're not necessarily places associated with fairies. Now, you could make an argument about them being spiritual places, but it's also worth bearing in mind that we don't know the beliefs or rituals of the prehistoric Irish, the monument builders. We're guessing that. We know certain things. They built stone circles, places like Newgrange with alignments, but we can't say for certain what the rituals were or what the reasons were. So it's just worth holding on to that as well as we go forward. Now, the reason why I said Omnagat is somewhere different, although it appears in Irish mythology, is of course it is associated with the other world and fairies, particularly at Samhain, and it's associated with the Morrigan, of course, as well. So Omnagat is certainly one place that is associated with fairies, but if you want to go and have those types of encounters, again, I would refer you to our lore and what happens to people who tend to do that, especially in a disrespectful sense. What about ancient monuments then? If you go and visit a stone circle or a dolmen or a rath, are there connotations there in relation to fairies? Well, yeah, there are actually. Oftentimes, again, these move all the way up into modern times. A story I mentioned quite recently was going to a place in order to get a fairy gift. But also it's worth looking at the idea of stone circles being magical places as well. Joshua Cutchin's book, for example, Ecology of Souls, speculates that perhaps stone circles were ceremonial in the sense that they kept something in, and this is something fundamental in terms of protection, especially for those of you watching who have an interest in magic and the occult. If you're going to draw something from the other world, you need to be able to step back and leave it there and allow it to go back to where it came from. But yes, stone circles are definitely associated with fairies all the way up to today. What about places on top of mountain tops like Seafin, for example, or say Finnegan? Yes, in a way they're associated with fairies. Some people say they've had encounters there. I often think that these places are more initiatory, and that oftentimes it's very hard to get to them. You know, they're on top of a mountain and you have to trek through forests and so on. So again, they're not always associated with fairies, and perhaps they had other functions as well, which I write about quite a bit on the page, so you can go there to find out what I think about those places. But more interestingly for me, what about the landscape itself? Forests, trees, wells, springs. Yes, they are very much associated with fairies and fairy encounters. You can look at the hawthorn tree, for example. It's one I think everyone knows is associated with fairies, not only for magical reasons, but people go there to a hawthorn tree and meditate, for example, and they'll come back and say they've had visions of fairy and so on. So there's something. Holy wells, often associated with saints today, were also places where people left votive offerings a long time ago, before Christianity came to Ireland, and we have the evidence of that. But my own feeling is that spirits and deities were much more localized, so it wasn't a case of one particular god or goddess being venerated at all of the holy wells. I would imagine that it was localized spirits close to the landscape of the people in this area itself. So after that then, there's some more interesting places we could talk about. We could talk about Tirnanogue, which is supposedly off the Western Ocean, and yes, Tirnanogue is very much associated with fairies, but I don't know how you're going to get there. And also High Brazil, of course, which is this mythical island which is said to appear every 7 years, and it's also associated with supernatural beings, but most Irish folklorists would not consider it Tirnanogue itself. It's just another world as such. But I've recently written about Irish spinner women, and we spoke about this before. Often women who are spinning would go into hypnagogic states, and they would either draw fairies to them or they would fall into the other world themselves. And that's really the crux of it when it comes to Irish fairies and Irish fairy encounters and Irish places of fairies. You don't have to go to some national monument or a forest. Oftentimes it's a state of mind itself, and I don't think this will be news to most people, but I think it's more a case that by being at an ancient place, it will certainly set the scene for you and help with your just to be able to get into that particular state, your surroundings. Oftentimes as well, I often think your own metabolism, how you've prepared your body, like what you're going to be susceptible to. And of course there are certain days of the year which are associated with fairies, for example the equinoxes and the solstices and the quarter days and dusk and dawn. So hopefully that will help people just get through a bit of the confusion about famous Irish places. They're not always the places that you think. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope that clarifies it for some people.